The morning of December 8th, 1941, dawned across Tokyo with a peculiar quietness. In the conference rooms of Imperial General Headquarters, staff officers gathered maps and intelligence reports, their movements precise and unhurried. The previous night's attack on Pearl Harbor had exceeded even optimistic projections. 8 American battleships damaged or destroyed, hundreds of aircraft burning on their runways. The Pacific Fleet, Japan's greatest obstacle to southern expansion, crippled in a single morning, but as these officers reviewed their triumph, they spoke not of what they had destroyed, but of what they believed they had secured. Geography itself. Lieutenant General Hideki Tojo stood before a relief map of the Pacific Ocean, his finger tracing the vast emptiness between the Hawaiian Islands and Japan's home waters. Nearly 6,000 miles of ocean. No airfield existed within that expanse capable of supporting heavy bomber operations. The closest American bases lay in the Philippine Islands, but Japan's southern offensive would sweep those aside within months. Beyond that, only Hawaii offered suitable facilities for long-range air operations, and Hawaii sat an impossible 4,000 miles from Tokyo. The mathematics seemed inescapable. America's premier heavy bomber, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, possessed a maximum range of roughly 2,000 miles, barely half the distance required. Even if American engineers somehow doubled this range, where would such aircraft stage from? Between Hawaii and Japan lay nothing but scattered coral atolls and volcanic specks, tiny islands that Japanese naval officers dismissed as strategically worthless. These desolate rocks lacked harbors, they lacked fresh water, they lacked the level ground necessary for airfields. They were, in every practical sense, useless. This confidence flowed from reasonable military calculation. Japan had constructed its defensive perimeter with precise attention to the limitations of contemporary aviation technology. The inner ring of this defense, comprising the Mariana Islands, the Caroline Islands, and the Marshall Islands, lay roughly 1,500 to 2,000 miles from Tokyo. Japanese forces had fortified these island chains with airfields, coastal artillery, and garrison troops. Even if Americans somehow established forward bases here, conventional bombers would struggle to reach the home islands with meaningful bomb loads. Major Yoshio Kodama, assigned to aerial defense planning, presented his analysis to senior staff with quiet certainty. According to the calculations preserved in Japanese military archives, even the theoretical superbombers American aviation magazines occasionally speculated about would require bases no more than 1,500 miles from target cities to conduct sustained operations. The Mariana Islands fall within this critical zone, Kodama acknowledged, gesturing at Saipan, Tinian, and Guam on the map. But these islands measure less than 50 square miles each. Building airfields capable of handling heavy bombers would require engineering efforts beyond any previous military construction project. His audience nodded agreement. They had observed American construction capabilities in the Philippines before the war. Competent, certainly, but nothing suggested Americans could transform remote volcanic islands into major air bases while conducting simultaneous naval campaigns across thousands of miles of ocean. The logistical requirements alone seemed insurmountable. Every ton of concrete, every gallon of fuel, every piece of heavy equipment would need to cross 6,000 miles of water. The supply ships themselves would require protection from submarines and air attack throughout their journey. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Americans lack the industrial capacity for such undertakings, Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue added, his assessment reflecting the consensus view among Japanese strategists. Their production capabilities are dispersed across civilian industries. Our intelligence estimates suggest they can produce perhaps 5,000 aircraft annually. Impressive by peacetime standards, but inadequate for the sustained campaigns such operations would require. These calculations, carefully documented in the files that would later be captured by American forces, underestimated not merely American industrial capacity, but American determination. The vast Pacific, which seemed Japan's greatest strategic shield, would become a highway for unprecedented military logistics. The useless islands would bristle with runways, and the sound of aircraft engines would fill Tokyo's skies with terror far exceeding anything these confident officers imagined possible. But on that December morning, as staff officers congratulated themselves on their geographic fortress, none suspected that within 3 years those worthless specks of volcanic rock would become launching platforms for the most devastating air campaign in human history. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the illusion of Tokyo's invulnerability shattered in 16 dramatic seconds. On April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's specially modified B-25 Mitchell bombers launched impossibly from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet and appeared over the Japanese capital in broad daylight. They dropped their bombs across Tokyo, Yokohama, and Nagoya before fleeing toward China. The physical damage proved minimal, destroying only 50 buildings and killing approximately 50 civilians. But the psychological impact thundered through Japan's military establishment like an earthquake. If carrier-launched medium bombers could strike Tokyo, what might heavy bombers accomplish from land bases? Emperor Hirohito himself demanded answers from his military chiefs. General Hajime Sugiyama, chief of the Imperial General Staff, scrambled to explain how American aircraft had penetrated defenses that were supposed to be impregnable. The raid exposed a fundamental vulnerability in Japanese strategic thinking. While they had calculated correctly that conventional bomber operations from distant bases remained impossible, they had not anticipated American ingenuity in delivering air power through unconventional means. The Doolittle raid, though tactically insignificant, forced Japanese planners to confront an uncomfortable truth. If Americans were willing to launch bombers from aircraft carriers, they might attempt even more audacious schemes to bring Tokyo within bombing range. In Washington, Army Air Forces commanders drew different conclusions from Doolittle's success. Major General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, recognized that carrier-launched raids could never sustain a strategic bombing campaign. What America needed was a bomber with unprecedented range and payload capacity, combined with forward bases close enough to bring Japan's industrial heartland under sustained attack. By mid-1942, Boeing engineers were already developing such an aircraft, the B-29 Superfortress. This revolutionary bomber promised a combat radius of 1,600 miles while carrying 4 tons of bombs, capabilities that dwarfed anything previously attempted in aviation history. But even the Superfortress faced what planners called the tyranny of distance. Arnold's staff calculated that B-29s would need bases no more than 1,500 miles from Tokyo to conduct effective operations. They spread maps across conference tables and studied the Pacific with fresh eyes. The Philippine Islands would have served perfectly, but Japan now controlled them. China offered possibilities, but supplying bases there required flying everything over the Himalayan hump from India, a logistical nightmare that would consume more resources than it could deliver. Then, someone's finger traced a line of tiny islands in the Central Pacific. The Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam sat approximately 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. Precisely the range they needed. Japanese forces currently occupied all 3 islands, considering them useful primarily as outpost positions in their defensive perimeter. American planners began to see these useless specks of land as potential launching platforms for the most devastating air campaign in history. But recognizing the strategic value of these islands proved far simpler than actually reaching them, capturing them, and transforming them into functional bomber bases. Throughout the summer and fall of 1942, American military planners confronted what they privately called the island problem. Even if the Marianas offered ideal geographic positioning for bombing Tokyo, transforming these remote volcanic outcrops into functional air bases presented engineering challenges of staggering magnitude. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, and General Arnold engaged in heated debates about whether such an undertaking was even feasible. The Marianas lay deep in Japanese-controlled waters, surrounded by enemy bases in the Carolines and Marshalls. Simply reaching these islands would require a massive naval campaign, followed by amphibious assaults against fortified positions. Then, assuming successful capture, the real work would begin. Major General Curtis LeMay, who would later command the B-29 campaign, examined engineering surveys of the Mariana Islands with growing concern. Saipan, the largest of the strategic trio, measured only 12 miles long and 5 miles wide, with most of its interior dominated by volcanic peaks and dense jungle. Tinian was similarly constrained, while Guam, though larger, had been fortified by Japan since capturing it in December 1941. None possessed natural harbors capable of handling the cargo ships that would be required to supply major air operations. None had adequate sources of fresh water, and, most problematically, none had level terrain suitable for the massive runways that B-29s would require. These bombers weighed 60 tons when fully loaded and needed runways at least 8,000 feet long and 200 feet wide, roughly double the dimensions of standard fighter strips. The Navy's construction battalions, the famous Seabees, studied the problem with characteristic ingenuity. Their engineers calculated that building a single bomber runway on these islands would require removing thousands of tons of volcanic rock, filling ravines, leveling hillsides, and creating artificial foundations where solid bedrock didn't exist. They would need to import virtually all construction materials: steel matting, concrete, asphalt, heavy equipment, all across thousands of miles of ocean. They would need to construct ports where none existed, erect housing for tens of thousands of personnel, build fuel storage facilities, ammunition dumps, repair shops, and command centers. Each island would essentially require transformation from a tropical wilderness into a complete military-industrial complex. And they would need to accomplish all this while under potential Japanese air attack and possibly facing desperate counteroffensives. Some senior officers argued the entire concept was impractical. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific forces, suggested that resources would be better spent advancing through the Southwest Pacific via New Guinea and the Philippines, MacArthur's preferred route. This approach offered stepping stone bases through relatively shorter ocean passages and would eventually reach Formosa or the Chinese coast, from which Japan could also be bombed. But Arnold's air planners insisted the Marianas route was superior. From the Marianas, B-29s would operate entirely over water, avoiding the need to coordinate with Chinese forces or navigate the complex political situation in China. The islands themselves, once captured and developed, would become unsinkable aircraft carriers, requiring no fuel to maintain position. Most importantly, the Marianas provided the straightest line to Tokyo. In modern warfare, Arnold argued, strategic air power would prove decisive, and the shortest path to Japanese surrender ran through these tiny islands that Japan had dismissed as strategically peripheral. While strategists debated Pacific geography, Boeing engineers in Seattle worked through 1942 and into 1943, solving unprecedented technical challenges to create the B-29 superfortress. Edward Curtis Wells, Boeing's chief engineer, led a team designing an aircraft that would redefine long-range bombing. The specifications, demanded by the Army Air Forces, seemed almost fantastical. A bomber capable of cruising at 30,000 feet, beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters, carrying 4 tons of bombs across 1,600 miles, defended by 12 50-caliber machine guns in remote-controlled turrets, and pressurized to allow crews to operate at extreme altitudes without cumbersome oxygen equipment. No bomber in production anywhere in the world approached these capabilities. The development program faced crisis after crisis. Early test flights revealed serious engine problems. The Wright R-3350 Cyclone engines had an alarming tendency to overheat and catch fire. On February 18, 1943, Boeing's second prototype crashed in Seattle, killing the entire test crew, including Boeing's chief test pilot, Edmund Allen. The accident investigation revealed that magnesium engine components had ignited during flight, a flaw that required urgent redesign. General Arnold, watching development delays accumulate while Japanese forces consolidated their Pacific defenses, sent increasingly urgent messages to Boeing executives. The War Department had already ordered over 1,500 superfortresses based on promising early tests, gambling on Boeing's ability to resolve the technical issues. If the B-29 program failed, the entire strategy for defeating Japan would require fundamental reconsideration. Boeing's engineers worked with desperate intensity through the spring and summer of 1943. They redesigned engine cowlings to improve cooling, modified the fuel system to reduce fire risk, and strengthened wing structures to handle the unprecedented weights and stresses. By late 1943, production models finally began rolling off assembly lines not only at Boeing's Seattle plant, but also at new factories in Wichita, Kansas, and at Bell Aircraft in Georgia. Each superfortress contained 55,000 different parts and required 7,000 engineering drawings. The aircraft cost approximately $640,000 each, more than 3 times the price of a B-17, making them the most expensive weapons in the American arsenal, except for the still secret atomic bomb project. As 1944 dawned, the first B-29 combat units began forming and training. The 58th Bombardment Wing prepared to deploy to India for operations against Japan from Chinese forward bases, a preliminary campaign while the Pacific Island bases were still under Japanese control. But Arnold and his staff already looked beyond this stopgap solution. They were creating the 20th Air Force, an entirely new organization that would report directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff rather than to theater commanders. This unprecedented arrangement reflected the revolutionary nature of strategic bombing theory, the belief that air power alone might force Japan's surrender without requiring a costly invasion. But theory required geography. The superbombers needed the superbases, and those bases existed only in Japanese hands, on islands Japan's military had long dismissed as too small and remote to matter in modern war. On June 11, 1944, the massive American fleet that had been assembling in the Marshall Islands began moving westward through the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the Joint Expeditionary Force comprising more than 500 vessels, battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transport ships, and landing craft. Below decks and in troop compartments, 71,000 Marines and soldiers of the 5th Amphibious Corps prepared for what would become one of the largest and most consequential amphibious operations in the Pacific War. Their objective, the Mariana Islands. Their mission, Operation Forager. The campaign to seize Saipan, Tinian, and Guam from Japanese control. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Forces, had staked American strategy in the Pacific on this operation. If it succeeded, Japan's home islands would come within range of sustained bombing. If it failed, the Pacific War might drag on for years. Japanese commanders in the Marianas had not been idle since Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded 31,000 troops on Saipan, while Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had led the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, now coordinated naval air forces in the islands. They had transformed Saipan's volcanic terrain into a fortress with coastal artillery positions covering likely landing beaches, cave networks carved into limestone cliffs, and defensive lines utilizing every ridge and ravine. Nagumo understood what these islands meant to Japan's defense. In a message to Imperial Headquarters, he had written that if the Marianas fell, hell is on us. Japanese propaganda had long assured the public that the outer defensive perimeter was impregnable, but military professionals recognized that American industrial power was generating a tidal wave of ships, aircraft, and supplies that would eventually overwhelm any static defense. On June 13, 1944, American battleships began the naval bombardment of Saipan. The guns of USS Tennessee, California, Maryland, and Colorado, most of them veterans of Pearl Harbor, now refloated and returned to service, pounded Japanese positions. For 2 days, thousands of tons of high-explosive shells crashed into pillboxes, artillery emplacements, and supply dumps. Naval aviators from Task Force 58 flew hundreds of sorties, bombing and strafing any target that showed resistance. Then, at dawn, on June 15th, the landing craft headed towards Saipan's southwestern beaches. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions hit the shore under intense Japanese fire. Artillery shells and mortar rounds exploded along the beach. Machine gun positions that had survived the bombardment opened fire on the Marines struggling through the surf. The battle for Saipan would rage for 24 days. Marines fought yard by yard through sugarcane fields, across rugged volcanic terrain, and into fortified cave complexes where Japanese defenders fought to the death. On July 7th, 1944, as American forces finally secured the island's northern end, more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians participated in one of the war's most tragic episodes, a mass suicide charge and civilian deaths at Mapi Point, which Americans would remember as Suicide Cliff. General Saito and Admiral Nagumo both committed ritual suicide rather than surrender. When the island was finally secured on July 9th, American casualties totaled more than 16,000, including over 3,000 killed. Japanese losses approached 30,000, but the United States now possessed what its military planners had fought to obtain: the first of the Mariana Islands, positioned 1,500 miles from Tokyo. Before the last shots were fired on Saipan, CB construction battalions were already coming ashore with their bulldozers and construction equipment, preparing to transform this blood-soaked island into an airbase. Within hours of Saipan's capture on July 9, 1944, the first CB bulldozers rumbled off landing craft onto the island's beaches. These Navy Construction Battalion engineers faced a transformation challenge unprecedented in military history: convert 3 volcanic islands with minimal infrastructure into the world's largest and most sophisticated bomber bases, and do it while war still raged across the Pacific. Rear Admiral Francis Rockwell, commanding the base development program, arrived with detailed plans that called for 6 major bomber runways across the Marianas, each 8,500 feet long and 200 feet wide, plus taxiways, hardstands for hundreds of aircraft, fuel storage facilities capable of holding millions of gallons of aviation, gasoline, ammunition bunkers, repair depots, barracks for 50,000 personnel, and complete port facilities to handle the cargo ships that would sustain operations. The construction effort on Saipan began before the battle had fully concluded, while Marines still fought Japanese holdouts in the island's northern caves. Seabees worked in the southern portion, clearing the dense jungle and sugarcane fields near Isley Field, the existing Japanese airstrip. Using massive Caterpillar D8 bulldozers, they began the brutal work of transforming tropical terrain into modern airbases. Volcanic rock had to be crushed, coral limestone excavated, irregular ground leveled with mathematical precision. The existing Japanese runway was only 4,000 feet long and poorly constructed, adequate for fighters but useless for heavy bombers. Seabees completely rebuilt it, extending the runway to proper dimensions and constructing a parallel strip. They worked in 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, under tropical sun and torrential monsoon rains. Coral dust covered everything and everyone, turning the construction zones into landscapes that resembled the moon more than Earth. Tinian, captured between July 24th and August 1st, 1944, presented different challenges. This island was slightly flatter than Saipan, but covered with cultivated fields. The Japanese had operated large-scale sugar plantations here before the war. Seabees found Tinian's relatively level northern plateau ideal for runway construction. They laid out plans for 4 parallel runways, creating what would become the most concentrated heavy bomber base in history. Northfield on Tinian would eventually host 4 complete bombardment wings, more than 200 B-29s operating from a single complex. The construction effort required clearing 1,500 acres of land, moving more than 11 million cubic yards of earth and coral, and pouring enough concrete to build a highway from New York to Philadelphia. As documented in historian Barrett Tillman's accounts of the 20th Air Force operations, the Seabees accomplished in 4 months what would have taken 3 years in peacetime. Guam, the largest of the 3 islands and the last to be secured on August 10, 1944, received even more elaborate development. As an American possession before the war, Guam held symbolic importance beyond its strategic value. The construction program here created 2 major bomber fields, North Field and Northwest Field, plus extensive support facilities. By late 1944, supply ships were arriving daily at Apra Harbor, which engineers had expanded and deepened to handle the unprecedented traffic. They offloaded aviation gasoline in 55-gallon drums, bombs by the thousands, spare parts, construction materials, food and equipment. The Marianas bases were consuming supplies at rates that staggered even experienced logistics officers. A single B-29 mission required aviation fuel, bombs, ammunition for defensive guns, spare parts, and provisions for 11-man crews. Multiply this by hundreds of bombers flying missions every few days, and the consumption exceeded that of many small nations. Yet American industrial capacity proved equal to the challenge, shipping everything needed across 6,000 miles of ocean. On October 12, 1944, Brigadier General Haywood Hansell arrived on Saipan to assume command of the 21st Bomber Command, the organization that would conduct the strategic bombing campaign against Japan from the Marianas. His initial forces consisted of the 73rd Bombardment Wing, still in the process of deploying from training bases in the United States. The first B-29s had made the arduous flight across the Pacific via Hawaii and Kwajalein, island hopping with carefully calculated fuel loads. By late October, sufficient numbers had arrived to begin planning combat operations. Hansell, a protege of precision bombing theory, intended to demonstrate that daylight high-altitude attacks on specific industrial targets could systematically destroy Japan's capacity to wage war. He selected aircraft engine factories, munitions plants, and steel mills as primary targets. Tokyo itself would be the first objective. On November 24, 1944, Thanksgiving Day in the United States, the moment that Japanese strategists had believed impossible finally arrived. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Marianas time, Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell led 111 B-29s off the runways at Saipan. The bombers assembled in formation and turned north, climbing to 30,000 feet for the 1,500-mile flight to Tokyo. For the crews, this inaugural mission carried enormous psychological weight. Many had read in newspapers about the Doolittle raid 30 months earlier, that audacious but ultimately symbolic strike. This was different. This was sustainable, strategic bombing, the beginning of a campaign that would not stop until Japan surrendered. The Silver Bombers flew north through the afternoon, crossing empty ocean where American submarines prowled and Japanese aircraft occasionally patrolled. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. As the superfortresses approached the Japanese coast in late afternoon, crews encountered challenges that would plague the bombing campaign for months. Powerful high-altitude winds, the jet stream, though meteorologists didn't yet fully understand the phenomenon, pushed aircraft off course and created unprecedented navigation difficulties. Cloud cover obscured many primary targets. Japanese fighter defenses, though surprised by the bombers' altitude and speed, managed to engage some formations. Anti-aircraft fire burst around the Cape. Bombers, though most shells exploded below the B-29's 30,000-foot altitude. When the bombardiers finally released their loads over the Musashi Aircraft Engine Factory in Tokyo's northwestern suburbs, the bombs scattered widely. Reconnaissance photos later revealed that only 48 bombs had hit anywhere near the target, causing modest damage to a facility that continued operating. Despite the disappointing physical results, the psychological impact of the November 24th raid resonated across Japan. For the first time since the Doolittle raid, air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo. Citizens who had been assured by their government that the home islands were beyond American reach now watched silver bombers gleaming at impossible altitudes, leaving contrails across the sky. Japanese radio initially dismissed the raid as inconsequential, claiming many bombers had been shot down, a false claim. But the civilian population recognized that something fundamental had changed. The Americans had found a way to bring war directly to Japan's heartland. In the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito demanded that his military leaders explain how this had happened and what could be done to stop further attacks. Military authorities admitted what strategists had feared since Saipan's fall. The Americans had successfully turned those useless islands into operational bomber bases. Tokyo now lay within range of sustained attack. The islands that Japanese planners had dismissed as too small and remote to matter strategically had become exactly what American air power theorists needed. Launching platforms positioned at the precise distance required for B-29 operations. The vast Pacific Ocean, which had seemed an impenetrable barrier protecting Japan's home islands, had become a highway for American bombers. And the campaign had only just begun. By January 1945, the strategic bombing campaign from the Marianas had become a source of deep frustration for American commanders. Despite flying dozens of missions and dropping thousands of tons of bombs, the 21st Bomber Command had achieved minimal strategic impact. The precision daylight bombing doctrine that worked tolerably well in Europe proved far less effective against Japan. Perpetual cloud cover obscured targets. The jet stream winds at 30,000 feet scattered formations and ruined bombing accuracy. B-29s suffered mechanical failures from the strain of maximum altitude operations. Most troubling, bomb damage assessments showed that targeted factories continued production with minimal interruption. General Arnold, watching from Washington, grew increasingly impatient with the campaign's meager results. On January 20th, 1945, he made a dramatic command change, replacing the methodical Hansel with Major General Curtis LeMay, a commander who had earned a fearsome reputation for achieving results regardless of orthodox doctrine. LeMay arrived on Guam and immediately began challenging every assumption about how to employ the superfortresses. A blunt, cigar-chomping officer who cared nothing for conventional wisdom, LeMay reviewed mission reports and recognized that high-altitude precision bombing wasn't working. Japanese industry operated differently from European factories. Production was dispersed among thousands of small workshops and home-based operations scattered throughout urban areas. Destroying a specific factory meant little when subcomponents were manufactured in dozens of locations. Moreover, Japanese cities themselves were vulnerable in ways European cities were not. Intelligence reports noted that most Japanese urban construction used wood and paper rather than brick and stone. Incendiary weapons might prove devastatingly effective against such structures. LeMay began planning a radical shift in tactics that would transform the bombing campaign from a precision operation into something far more terrible. On March 9th, 1945, LeMay implemented his revolutionary approach with a mission that would become infamous in the history of aerial warfare. He ordered 334 B-29s to attack Tokyo at night from low altitude, between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, carrying maximum loads of incendiary bombs rather than high explosives, with most defensive guns removed to save weight and increase bomb capacity. The crews were stunned by these orders. Flying low and slow over Tokyo at night made them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and searchlight-directed fighters. Removing defensive guns seemed suicidal, but LeMay had calculated that Japanese night defenses were poorly developed and that the potential for devastating effect justified the risk. At 10 minutes past midnight, on March 10th, the first B-29s arrived over Tokyo and began dropping M69 incendiary clusters over the city's Shitamachi district, a densely populated working-class area of wooden buildings. The attack created a firestorm that exceeded LeMay's most optimistic projections. The incendiaries, each cluster containing 47 bombs filled with napalm gel, ignited thousands of fires that quickly merged into a massive conflagration. Superheated air created its own wind system, pulling oxygen into the fire zone at hurricane speeds. Subsequent bomber waves found visibility obscured by smoke rising 30,000 feet. Crews reported that the heat turbulence from the fires below tossed their aircraft violently despite being miles above the flames. The fire consumed nearly 16 square miles of central Tokyo, destroying approximately 267,000 buildings. Civilian casualties reached approximately 100,000 dead, more than would die in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima 5 months later. The single night's attack killed more people than any other bombing mission in history. When reconnaissance aircraft photographed the devastation days later, the imagery showed vast stretches of Tokyo reduced to ash and rubble. LeMay's terrible gamble had worked. The useless islands now supported operations that were burning Japanese cities from the map. Through the spring and summer of 1945, the bomber offensive from the Marianas intensified into a systematic campaign of urban destruction. LeMay's forces conducted similar incendiary raids against Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities across Japan. By midsummer, the 20th Air Force had effectively run out of major urban targets. Nearly every significant Japanese city except Kyoto, spared for cultural reasons, and Hiroshima, Kokura, and Nagasaki, reserved for special weapons, had been attacked. The air bases that Seabees had carved from the Marianas' volcanic rock now hummed with constant activity. At Northfield, Ontinian, B-29s took off every 90 seconds during major missions, an aerial assembly line that sent hundreds of bombers northward, carrying death and fire. Japanese defenders struggled desperately to counter the raids, but found themselves overmatched by American technology and numbers. The Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Service threw everything available against the bomber streams. Conventional fighters, ramming attacks, even specially modified aircraft that tried to drop phosphorus bombs on the B-29 formations. Nothing proved effective enough to halt or even significantly slow the attacks. American fighter escorts complicated Japanese defensive efforts further. The P-51 Mustang, operating from newly captured Iwo Jima, could now accompany bombers all the way to Japan and back. Japanese interceptor pilots found themselves fighting not only against the heavily armed superfortresses, but also against some of the most accomplished fighter pilots in the American military. By June 1945, Japan's air defenses had been systematically degraded to near impotence. On August 6, 1945, a specially modified B-29 named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from Northfield, Ontinian, carrying a single bomb unlike any other weapon in human history. The aircraft flew north on a route identical to the hundreds of conventional bombing missions that had preceded it. At 8:15 in the morning local time, Bombardier Major Thomas Ferriby released the atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, over Hiroshima. The weapon detonated 43 seconds later at an altitude of 1,900 feet, creating a fireball as hot as the sun's surface and destroying approximately 5 square miles of the city instantaneously. 3 days later, on August 9th, another B-29, named Boxcar, carried a second atomic weapon, Fat Man, to Nagasaki. These missions represented the culmination of 2 massive secret programs: the Manhattan Project, which developed the bombs, and the Marianas bases development, which provided platforms to deliver them. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made an unprecedented radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender. In his address, carefully crafted to avoid explicit admission of defeat, he noted that the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. He did not mention the months of conventional incendiary bombing that had already devastated Japan's cities, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and destroyed the nation's capacity to sustain war. The atomic weapons provided a face-saving explanation for surrender, but military historians would long debate whether Japan would have capitulated from conventional bombing and blockade alone. What remained undebatable was the strategic transformation that had occurred. Islands that Japan's military had dismissed as too small and remote to matter strategically had become the launching platforms for the most devastating air campaign in history. The 3-year journey from B-29s cannot reach Tokyo to atomic weapons falling from Marianas-based bombers represented a revolution in military geography, engineering, and the terrible logic of total war. The air bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell silent after Japan's surrender, their missions accomplished. The thousands of Seabees, air crews, ground personnel, and support troops who had transformed these Pacific specks into instruments of victory began the process of demobilization and returned to peacetime life. The strategic implications of the Marianas campaign reached far beyond the immediate defeat of Japan. American military planners had demonstrated that geography no longer provided the protection it once had. Remote islands, dismissed as strategically worthless, could be transformed through engineering determination and industrial might into forward operating bases capable of projecting devastating power across thousands of miles of ocean. The lesson was not lost on military strategists worldwide. In the emerging Cold War, both the United States and Soviet Union would seek island chains, remote bases, and forward positions from which to project air power against potential adversaries. The Marianas model, converting seemingly useless territory into vital strategic assets through massive construction efforts, would be replicated across the globe, from Iceland to Okinawa, from Diego Garcia to Guam itself, which remains a critical American military hub today. The pattern established in 1944 continued to shape military geography for generations. The engineering achievement represented by the Marianas bases also demonstrated the power of American industrial capacity when fully mobilized. The Seabees had accomplished in months what would have taken years in peacetime, moving millions of cubic yards of earth, pouring hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete, and constructing facilities that rivaled major airports in scope and sophistication. This capability to project not just military force but industrial infrastructure across oceanic distances marked America's emergence as a global superpower. Japanese military analysts, reviewing their nation's defeat in the post-war years, returned repeatedly to their fundamental miscalculation about the Marianas. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had served on the Imperial Japanese Navy's staff, wrote in his diary that we failed to recognize that Americans would transform geographic obstacles through sheer industrial force. We calculated based on what was possible for Japan. We did not comprehend what was possible for America. This gap between Japanese assumptions and American capabilities extended beyond construction engineering. Japanese planners had estimated American aircraft production at 5,000 planes annually. Actual production in 1944 alone exceeded 96,000 aircraft. They had assumed American forces, spread across 2 oceans, fighting 2 wars simultaneously, couldn't possibly maintain the logistical support required for sustained operations from remote Pacific islands. Yet, by mid-1945, over 100 cargo ships were dedicated solely to supplying the Marianas bases. The mathematical advantage proved insurmountable. Each B-29 mission consumed 6,400 gallons of aviation fuel and dropped 8 tons of bombs. Multiply this by hundreds of bombers flying missions every few days, and the consumption rates exceeded the industrial output of many nations. Yet, American supply ships kept arriving, Japanese cities kept burning, and the campaign continued without pause until surrender. The technological lessons from the B-29 campaign also influenced post-war aviation development. The Superfortress had pioneered pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, and long-range navigation systems that became standard features in subsequent bomber designs. More importantly, it had demonstrated the viability of strategic bombing as an independent instrument of military power, a concept that would drive American defense policy for decades. The human cost of the campaign remained staggering and controversial. Conservative estimates suggest that conventional incendiary raids killed approximately 300,000 Japanese civilians, with the Tokyo firebombing of March 10th alone accounting for 100,000 deaths. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed an additional 200,000 people, many of them in the months following the attacks, as radiation sickness took its toll. LeMay himself acknowledged the moral complexity of his tactics. Years later, he reflected that if we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. His assessment recognized that the distinction between military and civilian targets had effectively dissolved during the campaign. Japanese industrial production, dispersed among residential neighborhoods, meant that destroying war-making capacity required destroying the neighborhoods themselves. American military and political leaders justified the bombing campaign, both conventional and atomic, as necessary to force Japan's surrender without the need for an invasion that would have cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and potentially millions of Japanese lives. Intelligence estimates suggested that Japan had mobilized civilian populations for a desperate defense of the home islands. Every man, woman, and child was being trained to resist with bamboo spears, if necessary. The prospect of fighting house to house through Japan's cities horrified American planners who had witnessed the fanatical resistance on Okinawa, where Japanese forces and civilians fought virtually to extinction rather than surrender. Whether the bombing campaign was militarily necessary or morally justifiable remained subjects of historical debate decades later. What was certain was that the Marianas had made it possible. Without those island bases positioned at exactly the right distance from Japan's cities, the strategic bombing campaign would have remained impossible. The islands, Japanese planners had dismissed as too small, too remote, and too difficult to develop, had become the key to Japan's defeat. The useless islands returned to relative obscurity after the war, though they remained American possessions. Tinian's North Field, which had been the busiest airport in the world during the final months of the war, fell silent. The runways that had launched atomic bombers began to crack and weather in the tropical climate. Jungle vegetation slowly reclaimed the land that Seabees had so laboriously cleared. But the strategic lesson persisted. The Pacific's vast distances, which had once seemed Japan's impregnable shield, had become highways for American vengeance. No place on Earth was too remote to reach, no island too small to develop, no target beyond the range of nations determined to project power across continents and oceans. The transformation of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam from worthless volcanic specks into launching platforms for history's most destructive bombing campaign demonstrated a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Geography still mattered, but industrial capacity and engineering determination could overcome almost any geographic obstacle. Japanese strategists in December 1941 had been correct that the Pacific Ocean formed a formidable barrier. They had been wrong in assuming that America lacked the capability or will to breach that barrier. The useless islands became useful through American effort, and Tokyo, which Japanese military planners had assured Emperor Hirohito remained beyond American reach, burned night after night as silver bombers flew south from the Marianas, their missions accomplished, their fuel tanks still half full. The war that began with Japanese confidence in geographic invulnerability ended with American bombers operating from bases that weren't supposed to exist, dropping weapons that weren't supposed to be possible, achieving results that weren't supposed to be achievable. The lesson echoed through subsequent conflicts and continues to shape military planning today. In an age of intercontinental ballistic missiles and global positioning satellites, the specific challenge of island bases and bomber range may seem antiquated, but the underlying principle remains constant. Strategic assumptions about what is possible or impossible can be overturned by opponents with greater resources, determination, and ingenuity. Japan's military leaders had built their defensive strategy on the mathematical certainty that American bombers couldn't reach Tokyo from existing bases. They were correct until Americans built new bases. They assumed small volcanic islands couldn't support heavy bomber operations. They were correct until Seabees transformed those islands They believed their cities were beyond the range of sustained attack. They were correct until B-29s proved otherwise. Every assumption was logical, based on existing conditions. Every assumption failed to account for America's capacity to change those conditions. The Marianas Campaign stands as testament to the power of logistics, engineering, and industrial capacity in modern warfare. Victory came not from superior tactics or strategy in any traditional sense, but from the ability to project industrial infrastructure across oceanic distances and sustain operations that consumed resources at rates previously considered impossible. The useless islands, once dismissed as strategic periphery, had become the centerpiece of Japan's defeat. And the sound of B-29 engines echoing across 1,500 miles of Pacific Ocean every night became the sound of geographic certainty collapsing under the weight of American industrial might. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.